Okay, thanks very much. And let me just say that it's a real honor to be on a panel with such a illustrious panel. In comparison, I am a small fry. I hope that if I ever reach the level of like prominence which Alan has reached, that I'll also come up and present in my sandals. Um, um, One of our statistical modeling exercises. Are you? I have I have colleagues making fun of me. And Chair, if you can time me, please, Chair, and give me 15 minutes, okay? One of our statistical modeling exercises was undertaken with the International Labour Organization and makes use of what's called the United Nations Global Policy Model. And it's essentially what the exercise asks is what happens to the economy if the wage share is increased. The wage share essentially, in layman's terms, being the share of wealth which workers receive in wages. This increase in the wage or the labor share could arise out of a number of factors. A rising wages and an institution of a minimum wage is, of course, only one hypothetical reason why the wage share might increase. There's been a quite strong correlation between increasing wage shares and fall in inequality. And the other is that there's been some conversation in South Africa on the notion of if South Africa is wage-led or if it is profit-led, which essentially means what spurs domestic demand and growth. So I've spoken a little bit about this, how the wage share is associated with falling inequality. This is not necessary. It depends, as we've seen earlier, on what part of the wage distribution is impacted by increasing wages. So if wages rise at the top only, then a rising wage share may not impact on inequality. But in many studies, there is an association between an increasing wage share and falling inequality. And there's also been a vast amount of evidence from everyone from the IMF to the World Bank to the Piketty, etc., which shows that falling inequality helps growth. There's three motivations for doing an exercise to show the increase in the wage share in South Africa. The first is that the wage share has been falling. It has recovered recently, but there was a dramatic fall in the share of wealth which was accruing in wages in the economy, as can be seen here. The other, and this is contested, there's been some recent evidence which looks, it's a contested issue at the moment, but this is from Berger, 2015, and it shows that labor productivity, so the output per worker, has increased faster than real wages in the economy. So by increasing the wage share, you could close that gap. The third reason is that South Africa's wage share is well below its emerging market peers. This is a very difficult graph to see, but every graph is the same axes, so from 45 to the 65. And it's fairly obvious that South Africa, the wage share is far lower than in many other countries. This issue of wage-led versus profit-led growth and what spurs the demand and growth in the economy. The main source comes from the paper cited there, and it shows that South Africa, that domestic demand is wage-led, but that overall demand is profit-led, which means, and this is kind of thrown out without necessarily a real explanation. So what they show is that in all countries, an increase in consumption helps to spur like, domestic demand, and that an increase in wages will help to spur consumption. But what they also show is an increase in wages might lead to falling investment and a fall in competitiveness. And it really is about which way those scales will be tipping, if it is constituted as wage-led or if it is profit-led. This idea of profit-led does not necessarily mean that higher profits in the economy actually spur growth. What that means, and the same authors, or one of them, has noted that the idea of non-wage-led growth is dysfunctional. This studies are quite problematic. It's an extremely small model. It's got 4 equations and a multiplier. It is not customized for like South Africa in any way. The data runs up till 2004, and the negative impact on investment is shown to fall in the post-apartheid period. So this model, which we're going to use, also helps to unpack if South Africa is wage-led or if it is profit-led, because what we're doing in the exercise is increasing the wage share. So essentially, we are increasing this side here, and we're seeing if it's outweighed by other factors, but in a far more sophisticated model. As I said earlier, it's the UN Global Policy Model, and it's motivated by those 3 things earlier, which was lifting the wage share, closing the gap between wages and productivity, and closing the gap between the wage share and South Africa's emerging market peers. And it plays out over a 10-year period. The UN Global Policy Model is what's called an econometric model, which uses international data set. It's used by the UN and the G20 in doing medium form term forecasting. It's a series of behavioral like relationships which are estimated econometrically, which means that the data of the countries are estimated through regressions, and the nature and magnitude of those relationships are established through an analysis of a time series of that data. I have both the like technical and specifications here, and I can speak more about this, but I'm not going to go into great depth. I'm going to try and go through these slides. This is just a graphical illustration of the model, which shows how various elements in the economy interact like with one another. What you see at the bottom here is that we're altering the functional distribution of income, and that's going to have a ripple effect throughout the economy, including integrating with the rest of the world and every other economy for which there is data. There's 6 distinct like benefits amongst others. I've mentioned that the relationships are estimated econometrically, that aggregate demand, so the level of spending in the economy, plays an important role, whereas that's not necessarily the case in other models. But this is subject to like sophisticated supply side constraints. It's particularly useful at modeling investment, unlike in like many of the CGE models, including that of the Treasury, by default, increase the wages, and falling savings lead to a fall in investment. Those sort of biases are like not present here. It uses it is Keynesian closures, but it's been tested with other closures. It takes account of the distribution of income, whereas many models don't. So who's receiving income matters. It is globally consistent, so it interacts with the rest of the world. And it has what's called a Koldor-Verdun effect, which is essentially about the impact of rising wages on productivity, which is a growing literature on the importance of that. My clock here says it's 10 minutes and 6 seconds. So, okay, I'm going to explain these scenarios in the meantime. It is 3 scenarios which impact on the wage share. In scenario 1, there is a 2% increase made to the wage share. In scenario 2, there is a larger increase made, but also an increase in infrastructural spending along the lines of the NDP. And in the third scenario, there's an increase in the wage share in both South Africa and globally. In any model, a whole series of ripple effects occur through a complex set of equations. And essentially, you look at the outcome and at what's going on, and you try to piece together a story on that. And of course, it's a simplified one, but it looks something like this. And I'm going to nuance this with offsetting impacts in a minute. Essentially, an increase in the wage share leads to a rise in consumption, which leads to a rise in output spurred by an increase in domestic demand, which leads to a rise in GDP growth, which has positive productivity impacts. As I say, I'll nuance this by offsetting the factors. I'm not going to go into great depth in each of the graphs because essentially the 3 scenarios, scenario 1's weakest, scenario 2 is intermediary, and scenario 3 shows the largest impact, which is true on all the variables. So we see the increase in the wage share, and I'll come to this at the very end. Also, we see an increase in consumption. The blue line is a business as usual line, and the other 3 lines are scenario 1, scenario 2, and scenario 3. So an increase in consumption, an increase in GDP growth, which then levels off because the increase in the wage share is being made at the outset. Okay, so that's the basic of the process that I've highlighted. Now, this could be offset by other factors and supply side factors. Inflation, like falling exports, falling investment, and the changes to employment. And we do see impacts there. Overall, inflation does not rise above a baseline. It's the uptake in spare capacity. It is positive for productivity. It effects which mean a cheaper output. It is a reduction in markups, and the increase in imports helps balances against domestic price rises. There is a worsening of the trade balance, but the price competitive is somewhat maintained through productivity increases. There's an increase in overall investment, although there is a fall in investment as a share of the GDP, but as GDP like rises, the overall investment rises, and bank lending also increases. Employment rises, which is largely due to what's called the estimated Okun's laws, which has to do with the rise of GDP in the economy. So you have that process that I've outlined earlier, and that process does interact with these offsetting like factors. But overall, it is a positive outcome. So the impact is similar in all scenarios. It's a greater impact the larger the increase to the wage share. Scenario 1 shows that the economy, if you don't change anything else, actually there's less of an impact. If you look all the way back here, the wage share for scenario 1 falls back down to its original level. And the largest impact occur, as we've heard earlier, if it is a complementary labor packages, and if it occurs the rest of the world. So the two main takeaway points is that a increasing wage share, if wages in the economy are a larger share of overall wealth, it is beneficial, subject to various factors, and that like South Africa is indeed spurred by an increase in wages. Thanks very much.